Hello, and welcome back to Sonata She Wrote. Today, I am finishing my analysis of the first movement of Schubert's Death and the Maiden String Quartet. To briefly summarize the exposition before we move on to the development and recapitulation, the piece opened with a dramatic P0 module, the Maiden's reaction to Death and Death's response to the Maiden. This was followed by an overdetermined primary theme, which cadenced 4 times total, if you count the space between P0 and P1 as a cadence, which I do. From there, Schubert used the music of P0 to transition into the medial caesura and first S theme, a dancing theme in F major which, although it did reach a PAC, failed to reach essential closure as the secondary theme continued after the point of cadence. This opened a space which Hepokoski and Darcy refer to as the Tri-modular block. In this chart, you can see a tri-modular block, or TMB, has 3 sections: an initial S which fails to close, a second transition and second medial caesura, and a second S. In Sonata Theory, these sections are labeled TM1, TM2, and TM3, but I prefer to just label them S1, TR2, MC2, and S2, as I think that makes it clearer what's going on and how these themes function. Where my analysis diverges from Hepokoski's analysis of this same piece is in the essential closure. Although the secondary themes of this piece reach several perfect cadences, I argue that the exposition itself is an example of expository failure. This is because of the return of the S theme after the point of cadence. So, here we are at the beginning of the development. Typically, this section might open with some kind of transition or bridge, or we might find ourselves in the original primary theme. But there aren't as many hard and fast rules in the development, so let's see where Schubert takes us. The development begins with a dramatic return of the material we just heard in the close of the exposition, S2's pre-cadential chord outlines, this time on an E-sharp diminished 7th chord, which, although briefly interrupted by D major, quickly point us towards cadence in F-sharp minor, the sharp 3 of this piece. In the Elements of Sonata Theory, Hepokoski and Darcy write that a development which begins with the secondary theme, or themes as the case may be, might be seen as attempting to shore up weaknesses in those thematic zones in the exposition. Certainly, the exposition's secondary themes experienced about as much weakness as they could have, in that they failed to reach closure. So, that makes sense as an opening move for this development. As if in symmetry of the exposition, this development also reflects the shifting tonality which began in D minor and then proceeded through F major into A major and then A minor. Here, our opening chord of C major is shocking enough, but to move on to F sharp minor is really outside of the tonal space of this sonata. From here, we'll be heading briefly into E minor before Schubert really pulls the rug out from under us. Before we hear more of this, I want to draw your attention to how Schubert inserts snatches of his previous themes, which occurred right before important cadential moments in the exposition, such as the outline of these chords here. They cleverly call to mind both the importance of these sections, highlighting the cadences and key changes, but also prime us to experience the initial failure of the exposition, which was not a failure to cadence, but rather a failure to accept that cadence. Rather like the Maiden's refusal to accept death. From E minor, we return to, of all places, D minor. Now, this wouldn't be too unusual if it were happening in the recap, but this is not recap. At least not a rotational one, which we look for in Sonata Theory. You may recall in Schubert's Opus 99 piano trio, which I also analyzed on this channel, some fuzziness around what was recap and what was development. If you are the type to look for a recap that begins with the appropriate tonality, regardless of the theme, I suppose this might be where you would place it. But in Sonata Theory, this material, which is the secondary theme through and through, is an indicator that this is still development and not a new rotation. When we get to measure 186, however, this moment might be when we start to think of the development and the recapitulation bleeding into each other. The accompaniment figures of this section, which I've marked retransition as it is really a dominant pedal, are part of the secondary theme. But these triplets, especially coming as they do after notes held for 3 beats, are motivically linked to the opening P0 module. You might be asking yourself, wait, why does this matter? Surely when the recap does and doesn't begin is the simplest question to answer of all. Well, I'll just let Schubert make his own case for how complex that can be. Although the material which begins the recap is our initial P0 module, remember this fleshed out version of P0, which includes not only thirds, but also these aggressive arpeggios, did not appear at the beginning of this piece, but rather was used as a P-based transition, which is what we have here. In the Exposition, this quickly moved into F major. Here, of course, we modulate into D major and stay there for the medial caesura. In terms of the telos of this sonata form, how should we interpret this section? We have a few options. Speaking technically, there isn't much amiss here. We might consider this to be a P-TR merger, combining elements of the primary theme with the transition so they are no longer two separate entities. My preferred interpretation, however, is that this is a continuation of the suppression of the P theme. Even in the Exposition, S2 initially appeared in A major, an anachronistic tonal choice when the primary theme was in D minor, which suggests a kind of blind denial of the initial condition of the sonata. Then, in the development, we all but skipped over the primary theme, only including the barest whisper of its motives in the retransition. Here, in the recap, this trend continues. The primary theme is excised from the rotation, and we move from violent transition into a lilting S theme. Where do we go from here, though? Will the secondary theme, or themes, continue their campaign of denial? Or can they accept closure, by which I mean death? This one initially seems like it might provide a sense of security, especially in the transition leading up to the medial caesura. We know from the exposition that although this turn to D major is exactly where we hoped to be, this theme does not have the staying power to get us to essential closure. Similarly to the exposition's layout, the theme is over a tonic pedal with a triplet figure in the accompaniment. The tonic pedal implies a sense of suspended animation or arrested development. This theme is adolescent and naive, almost like the titular Maiden. When harmonic treble rears its head in bar 229, the theme collapses and proceeds to flash back and forth between the major and minor mode until it completely dissolves and the second transition returns. Although this recap got off to an unexpected start, something very typical for Schubert's sonata strategy is the strong correlation between the layout of the exposition and the layout of the recap, what Hepokoski and Darcy refer to as correspondence measures. Knowing this, we should be expecting another tri-modular block, but where Schubert often diverges in his layout is by inserting new tonal strategies in each rotation. In the exposition, this second highly developmental transition took us into A major and then A minor. Ideally, we would now head to D major, or at least a tonality centered around D. The transition quickly leads us, at this point, not surprisingly, to a perfect cadence in D minor. Remember, the issue with this secondary theme, and the secondary theme zone in general, is not its inability to cadence. If anything, like the initial primary theme, this group of themes is overdetermined. But the issue, rather, is its inability to accept these cadences. At this point in the music, an eventual cadence in D minor seems inevitable, but the music's ability to allow that cadence to have structural weight is less certain. In keeping with the music's pattern of denial, Schubert tonicizes a Neapolitan chord in D minor and then uses that chord to unexpectedly pivot into, of all places, B-flat major, opening a second medial caesura on a dominant minor ninth chord in that key. Other than opening S2 with a cadence in B-flat major, however, this theme cannot go the distance. We might call the moments around bar 270 an implication at a dominant chord, but even when a strong tonic chord is placed on the downbeat, our cellist, either by its own celebration or to signal its rejection to the other instruments, reiterates the same figure which, in the exposition, signaled that this attempt at cadence would not stand. At this point of crisis in the exposition, the music regathered itself and headed towards the normative key and modality of A minor to cadence in before that cadence was rejected by the continuation of S2. Where will Schubert take us now? And we're back to staring down the utterly tragic barrel of a perfect authentic cadence in D minor. The point of modulation from B flat major into D minor is, of course, debatable, but I like to place it here around bar 277 because of this cadential 6/4 chord in D minor. Even though its resolution is deceptive and goes to B flat, 6 in D minor, to me, it is the first moment where we are twisting towards this tonality, and the pedal in B flat actually reinforces that feeling for me. It gives this music the same sense of useless denial that has plagued all of the secondary themes in this piece. Not surprisingly, we cadence in D minor here in bar 292. But again, in my opinion, of course, I would not say this counts as an accepted structural closure. The music which follows is absolutely S-theme, and remember, in Hepokoski and Darcy's own book, The Elements of Sonata Theory, for a theme to qualify as S aftermath rather than simply more S, what we are looking for in all cases is a drop into piano. But Schubert gives us the opposite. This music knows that it cannot escape this tonality and this cadence, but it refuses to accept that eventuality. Effectively, the music could end here in bar 297, but the long suppressed primary theme will not be silent. Here, Schubert is using a technique which one sometimes finds in Type 2 sonatas, and which has caused some theorists to mislabel, in my opinion anyway, some romantic sonatas as reverse recapitulations or bridge or mirror form. A P-based coda. The concept of a coda based on the primary theme is most common in Type 2 sonatas, but it does occur elsewhere, such in Type 1 sonatas which have no development, and rarer in Type 3 sonatas like this one. Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony Movement 1 is a famous example of a P-based coda in a Type 3 work. That piece, incidentally, also utilizes Schubert's strategy of a three-key exposition. A primary theme-based coda can be viewed as a type of final cadence enhancement, which certainly fits the conditions of the sonata form we just heard. Initially somber and unassuming, the coda transforms into an aggressive restatement of P1.1, which even flirts with B-flat major a bit, echoing the recap we just heard. Then it turns to a somber death march in D minor, with this wonderfully expressive and utterly Schubertian series of predominant chords and chromatic melody. I intend to examine the rest of the movements in this piece as well, so similarly to my examination of Haydn's 19th Symphony, I just want to quickly point out what was deformational about this movement, which might reoccur or, hopefully, resolve in the coming movements. The most obvious of those being, of course, expositional failure and finally, sonata failure. Sonata failure is something which I believe happens more and more often, especially in the Romantic period, which Schubert is both in and out of. But also very unusual is, of course, the Tri-modular block and specifically Schubert's treatment of it, which involves 3 key areas in the exposition. Finally, I think the element of denial has to be considered as an undercurrent of this work. In my analysis, I feel that, unlike a more usual, if there is such a thing, example of sonata failure, which would more likely cadence imperfectly in the correct key or cadence perfectly but in the wrong key, this piece has no trouble cadencing in any of its keys, correct or otherwise. What's unique to this music is its inability to accept those cadences. This work, like many Romantic and Proto-Romantic works, is symphonic in scale, and the remaining movements are theme and variations, scherzo, and finale in sonata form. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, as that really helps me out. Feel free to check out my Patreon, and keep an eye out for the remaining parts of this ongoing series.